For 2021, we're excited to get more people engaged and involved in Rainbow Push, supporting the programs of Push for Excellence and the Citizenship Education Fund. Now, if you're interested in public policy and you want to help change the policies that impact those who are incarcerated, you can do so. If you're interested in impacting public policies that benefit education and businesses with social economic solutions, you can do that as well. You can become a policymaker by becoming a member of Rainbow Push right now. Now, if you believe in the scholarships that we've given to thousands of students each year, you can help us out. We've awarded more than $10 million in scholarships year to date. Now, you can help young people achieve a higher education by becoming a member of Rainbow Push right now for the annual fee of only $35. And if you're a student or a senior, it's only $15. You can help us make a difference in the lives of millions. Now, if you watch us every week, or if you listen to us on the radio, or if you're viewing on social media, we need you to become a member. And how do you become a member? It's simple. Visit us at rainbowpush.org and press join. Maybe you'd like to support the work of Push. If so, it's really simple. You can do so by texting the word PUSH, that's P-U-S-H, to 41444 on your cell phone, and you can give any amount that you feel comfortable giving, or you can call us at 773-256-2775 or go to rainbowpush.org and push donate. So whenever you want to support, you can do it from anywhere. So keep pushing, because we're going to keep pushing for you and keep hope alive.
Good morning, all. Is it good afternoon or good morning?
Bit of all.
Okay. James, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to introduce our young lady, Amira Woods. I haven't met her, so Amira, your invitation to Chicago is wide open. So as soon as you finish, you can take the next flight to Chicago as soon as possible. For those
No problem.
For those who don't know Amira completed her undergraduate studies in political science at Columbia University and her graduate studies in political economy and government at Harvard. She is a Pan-African strategist, researcher, and advocate, specializing in social impact and innovation. Amira is a senior advisor at Shine, a community of practice bringing together philanthropists, faith and values-driven investors dedicated to financing community-based renewable energy initiatives around the world. She has been a regular commentator on BBC's The World Today and appears regularly on Al Jazeera, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, and GTN. She has written on a range of issues from climate change, trade and investment to US military policy. And ladies and gentlemen, I cannot continue to read what this woman is or has done. So please help me welcome Amira Woods.
Oh, thank you for that very gracious introduction and for the opportunity to be here and serve as moderator for this phenomenal panel. So friends, family, this is the International Forum to Address Racism Across the Globe. And what you will see is an assortment of dynamic leaders from literally throughout the world that will present for us their views on the moment we're in and also where we're going. So just as a bit of framing, this issue of race, we all know this has been a momentous season from the horrific killing of our brother George Floyd to what we see as the devastating impacts of the COVID crisis disproportionately impacting our communities. And we see it is throughout the world that our communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, are facing disproportionately the deaths from COVID, but also the economic disruptions from COVID. Job losses, loss of businesses, loss of livelihoods across the globe. And we also know that at the forefront of this moment are incredible activists, Some have taken on formal leadership roles, others have taken on leadership of movements, but there is this awakening that is changing literally the globe as we speak. And so we're coming together to talk about this, to create a space, thanks to all of our colleagues at Rainbow Push for having the vision to bring together this incredible panel. So what we will do is to give them opportunity to share their reflections on this moment we're in, but to also encourage a conversation about where we're going. We know that this is a time where many are saying build back better, and others are saying we need to not build back, but build forward. Because looking back, the injustices have been baked in. And how do we begin to emerge from this COVID catastrophe, understanding that there will be future pandemics, understanding that climate change has disproportionately impacted our communities, and we need a change. We need a change. Could reparations be a part of that change? What's happening in places around the globe? How do we begin to envision a better way to live and realize the dreams of our ancestors? So let's begin. We're going to start. We're going to start in France. We're going to start with Rakia Diallo, who many of you know. She's a writer, she's a journalist, she's a filmmaker and activist, and she's in the midst of a controversy over race, as is often the case right now. So maybe we will begin with her as a journalist, as a writer, as a filmmaker. How do you see this moment we're in? How are the barricades of racism and sexism coming down? What more needs to be done? And how would you encourage those who are listening today to join a forward looking strategy for our people to realize their fullest potential?
Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and I'm very honored to be speaking in such a distinguished assembly. And to open the conversation, I think that you tackle something very important, meaning that we are going through a global moment. It's the first time that several countries at the same time are questioning white supremacy and global anti-Blackness. And I think it has been a turning point in France, because we are in a country that is constantly trying to avoid the issue of race. I have to point out the fact that the word race, which is in the first article of our constitution, is still subject to removal. It was voted by the National Assembly, the fact that the word race should disappear from our constitution, because we have this idea that race is something biological, and that people here don't really understand race as a social construct. So instead of fighting racism, they are in the process of trying to remove the word from the constitution, which leads us not to have any ground to fight against racism. So what happened last year was very sad and horrendous, but at the same time, as the French media were covering what was happening in the US in a very accurate and precise manner, the local activists, especially the Comité Adama that was started after the death of Adama Traoré 5 years ago, just decided to say to the media, hey, you are covering very well what's happening in the US, but we are going through the same issues here in France. And it's time now to face the struggles that are here in France. We do not have the exact same history as the US, but France was a slave power, slavery power, and also a colonial power. So the issues of racism that we are going through today are the result of a long history of domination and dehumanization that we were not really facing honestly. So I think that was a turning point, and that forced the media and also the politics to address those issues, even if there was much denial. finally, we had an opportunity to put those issues at the center of the political landscape. So it was a win, but at the same time, it gave a ground to the far right and the National Front to say that we were losing our identity and that some people were trying to reinterpret the history and to erase our history. So as we are going to start to be in the process of the next presidential election, the challenge is to face those this backlash that is going from the far right, and try to present, to introduce those movements as being a threat to the old history of France. And what I can say as a tool that could be very helpful is the fact that the European Parliament voted last year to recognize slavery as a crime against humanity, which was inspired by a French law that was voted in 2001, is an interesting base to fight together. And I think that having the opportunity to make our voices global and to make people understand that the structure of white supremacy is not national, but global, is something that will help us facing it and maybe dismantling it. So I'm really glad and honored to be among you, because I think that we are creating a space that will help people that are acting on the grassroots level. I'm here and I'm happy to be able to speak to you today, but there are thousands of people who are facing a backlash after what happened last year, and who are not really able to voice at the same level as we do their concerns. So I think that we should use those platforms to make those voices louder, and maybe trying to help each other by giving a coverage of what is happening in other countries. And we know much about what is happening in the US, but not that much about what is happening in other European countries, for example. I know much more about the US than I know about what's happening in Italy, in Spain, even in Germany. And those countries are closer to me geographically than the US. So there is something to be built. And I hope that we are setting the first stone of the building that we will be building together. So thank you very much for listening to me. I can't wait to hear the next speaker.
Well, we are thrilled that you could join us, and we know there's a lot on your plate. So we're so grateful that you've carved out time. We heard you brilliantly, even though you were in the car. You came through loud and clear. We've got to build the foundation and look beyond our geographic borders to make sure that this is a global effort to confront the structural racism that we all are tackling. So let's move then. Still in Europe, but now that we have Brexit, we've got to recognize that the EU Parliament may have passed a measure, but now the UK is a separate entity. So let's move to the UK, and we start then first with Lord Simon Woolley, who is director and co-founder of Operation Black Vote, a national and internationally renowned racial equity organization. He was elected in April of this year, just a few months ago, as the principal of the Homerton College, Cambridge University, the first Black person to hold this post at either Oxford or Cambridge. His resume is quite intense. Please, Lord Woolley,
Thank you.
time to
Thank you.
share your reflections on this moment and
Thank you, Chair.
what you see.
And I am I'm deeply honored and humbled to be along a distinguished panel. And I would say, Chair, particularly at this time in our historic moment in history, that we come together to have, I would argue, potentially the biggest and greatest conversation that we can have in regards to the past and how it's still influencing the present. And you mentioned what Diane and I describe as a double global pandemic that occurred last year. The first one was COVID-19, and as you said, the way that it laid bare the already structural racial fault lines and exacerbated them. You know, this time last year when we were watching our screens and seeing doctors and nurses dying, 97% were Black and brown. Cleaners, porters, security guards. A minister said to me in the chamber that he thought COVID-19 was a racist disease. And I replied to him, nothing could be further from the truth. What this disease has done is laid bare racialized areas, low pay, poor housing, inequality in health. If you follow the disease, you'll see structural racism at its worst. That was one end of the pandemic. The other was watching a man die in front of our eyes. And we knew, everybody in this panel knew, Black people around the world knew, it wasn't just the knee that killed George Floyd, it was the American system. And that was the worst effects of a white supremacist system. And not just in the USA, but also in the UK too. So as a result, we had the greatest civil rights protests ever, actually, in terms of numbers, in terms of length of time, in which young people, a bit like the civil rights movement in the 60s, Black and white, predominantly Black-led, said, we want the greatest conversation that this country's ever had. To look at these institutions that were built in the times of the enslavement of Africans and the stealing of the colonization of our lands, the systems that were built then and had to justify murder and rape and everything else by dehumanizing us, those systems are still there now. And they're still delivering those outcomes. And I think that a lot of people began to see life, albeit a glimpse, through our lens and wanted to do something about it. So there was great conversations in businesses around the world. And we thought, well, Diane and I thought, well, we're onto something new now because people are wanting to think about structural racism. And then the backlash. And that was already coming before this, but now it's come as a tidal wave. And we've had a report just a few months ago that says structural racism doesn't exist. It says that because footballers are taking the knee, we're not dealing with, they call it white working class. So now they're framing the debate, if you deal with structural racism, you're against poor white people. We're in a war zone for this conversation. It should be the greatest conversation. It's turning into the nastiest conversation. We need to sow a golden global thread through activists and actors, because your struggle is mine and mine is yours. And you know, when I hear Europe, and I'll finish here, when I hear that Europe is having a debate on whether slavery is a crime against humanity, I see white privilege right there. That it should even be debated is deeply troubling and problematic for me. But I'm pleased we're here because it means the struggle continues.
Without a doubt, a luta continua, and you bring to mind the framing of Ubuntu. I am because you are because I am. What happens to one impacts all. So yes, there's so much there to unpack in terms of this war zone that we're currently facing. Maybe we stay in the UK and we move to the phenomenal Diane Abbott. Many of you know her well. She is the first Black woman ever elected to the British Parliament. She is the longest serving parliamentarian, represents the Labour Party in so many powerful ways through the shadow Secretary of Health, shadow Secretary of Development. She's done a lot, but she is representing Hackney North, and we're so honored that she is here with us. So maybe we stay in the UK and hear your reflections and see how you see this war zone evolving and reactions as we push back against the climate of structural racism.
Thank you very much, Amira. It's a tremendous privilege to be at this important international forum. And I would want to associate myself with the remarks of my parliamentary colleague and long-standing friend, Lord Simon Woolley. We are at a moment when it comes to institutional racism. And given how much that is thrown at us, it's sometimes easy to get bogged down in our difficulties, our trials and tribulations. But we struggle and sometimes we win. And I think it's important to register both. This meeting has a global perspective. I welcome that. But you'll forgive me if I focus for just a few minutes on one country, the United States, because so many of us internationally were horrified by the treatment of Black people and other people of color in the United States. But we've also been inspired to the resistance to those attacks. And I want to register a great triumph. Looking at it from across the Atlantic in the UK, it's been a great triumph. It's the triumph of the Black Lives Matter movement. And one person who will not be at all happy with events in the past year in the United States is the ex-president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Donald Trump was defeated fair and square at the polls. Black Lives Matter played a very important role in that. And Joe Biden is now president of the United States. So we struggle, but we can also win. But just to say a few words about the fight against racism here in Britain. To understand racism in Britain, to understand where it's come from and where it's going, I think there are three things you have to reflect on. One is the history of the British Empire. The other is the ongoing history of British colonialism. And the third, which has already been mentioned, is Brexit. The British Empire was, in its time, I think, one of the biggest territorial empires in the world. It was the empire, as the British like to boast, on which the sun never set. And it was built on a literature and a culture of white nationalism and white superiority. And sadly, although we've moved on since the height of the British Empire, some of that thinking has not been quite left behind. There were so many writers and so many poets who wrote at the height of empire. Kipling, some of you may have heard of, and it was Kipling who spoke about the lesser breeds without the law, meaning people of color internationally. And sadly, as I say, that type of thinking, we haven't entirely moved on from that. Our empire was followed by colonialism. And my parents were born and brought up in a former British colony, the Caribbean island of Jamaica. And the relationship between its former colonies and Britain, particularly since the Second World War, has shaped issues around race. And the British, having gone overseas to other people's countries to build an empire, former citizens of the empire and the Commonwealth are now in Britain and actually helping to make this country not just a more diverse place, but a richer place. However, although there's a lot of positive thinking and welcome for the new diverse Britain we see in 2021, you still see a certain amount of resistance, and that is rooted in the thinking and the ideas of colonialism. And of course, most recently, we've seen Brexit. Now, Brexit, I think, must be the biggest act of self-harm of the British nation. And it's an act of self-harm which, sad to say, is based in thinking about racial superiority. And for Britain to have done this harm to itself, to be causing the problems it's causing because of Brexit, is very sad indeed. So as we go forward, what is required? First of all, it is required never to forget our history, the history of empire, and how, to an extent, we're still trammeled by it. It's important to understand that colonialism was not a positive experience for many of Britain's former colonies, although many of the people in those colonies have a great deal of affection and support for the British. And we also have to move beyond some of the self-harming notions of racial superiority which characterized Brexit. So we have to understand the past in order to move beyond the past. We have to, I hope in Britain, have the same sort of victory over Boris Johnson as you had in America over Donald Trump. And I think if we can have that political victory and continue to make those cultural advances in understanding, and finally, if we understand that the fight against racism is a global struggle, I believe that in all our lifetimes, we can continue to see the progress on fighting racism that we need to see, not just for our generation's benefit, but for the benefit of generations still to come. Thank you very much, Amira.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think, you know, you hit the nail on the head. We've got to know our history and understand how that history is impacting the present and also will impact the future. I know we have a bit of a time crunch with our sister Rokia, and so I know we want to come across the Atlantic, and we still have Sweden and a few other places to go to. But I wonder if we could just circle back for a moment to see if, Rokia, now that you've heard this kind of setting of the stage in terms of particularly the lens from the UK, if there are any additional comments you have, particularly in this question of the victories. Huh? I think you know I think we're being encouraged by Diane Abbott to think about the victories that we've gained and the work still to come. So before you leave us, Rokia Jallow, I'm wondering if you could share with us your sense of where you see the victories to come and where you think the pressure points are as we move in steady ground to build the foundation towards those victories.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Diane Abbott. I really appreciated your speech. That is very encouraging. That is very powerful and empowering. So thank you for that. I think that what you just said about Boris Johnson also applies to our country. And I think that we are facing in Europe the rise of several leaders from the far right, and they are not really faced with as much opposition as they should be. There is a kind of trivialization of those kind of ideas. And I think that putting the fight against the far right at the core center of our fight, of our struggle, is something that needs to be done, because the mainstream discourse tends to make them as common as any other parties. And we need to put them in perspective with the history and to remind from what background they come and what they stand for, what they are capable of doing, what their threat, which rights would be withdrawn, would disappear if they were elected. So maybe having a platform, an international platform to monitor, to maybe watch to watch the expression of the far right and how the far right is making its its discourse mainstream, and how the other parties, instead of building a discourse that would be the opposite, are just running after them and putting more and more in the mainstream space their discourse that is aiming minorities, that is promoting a polite version of racism, that is the same racism that was operating back in history. So we need to maybe to learn more about our history and to understand what is repeating in a different way, but what logics are being repeated now. And I think that maybe understanding that Boris Johnson is the same kind of person that Marine Le Pen here in France, that Viktor Orban in Hungary, and other far-right leaders in many different countries is maybe a way to have much more leverage. And I totally agree with what was just said about history, about the fact that we are going through a moment that is like unprecedented, and that we need to use that moment and not to lose the momentum, because we never had such an opportunity to speak together and to be heard together. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that says a lot. Like, democracy is under threat. The far right is on the rise. They are mainstreaming their discourse, and we've got to see this as a global phenomena and attack it from a global platform. So, with that, I think we're going to next move to the US. We hopefully will come back to Sweden, but let's move to the US. And because, you can't mention the right wing and mainstreaming their discourse, unfortunately, without remembering January 6th in the US, when there was a quite blatant and flagrant coup attempt by the right wing in the US, rooted in racist white supremacist thinking ideology driven by the former president, who many of us don't even like to call his name. But maybe we shift to the US across the Atlantic, and we begin. We have our colleague who is an MSNBC contributor. She comes with an incredible background, having lived not only in the US, but in Switzerland, in Canada, and really throughout the world. So maybe we come to you next for your reflections on this moment that we're in, where you see the achievements, but also the challenges, and the work that you see that's needed for us to realize the dreams of our ancestors.
First of all, thank you so much for that introduction, and to Rainbow Push Coalition, thank you for putting on this magnificent panel. I am chair of the board of Rainbow Push, but I do also have another hat where I am president of the National Bar Association, which is the largest and oldest bar association of people of color, primarily of African descent, in the world. We have over 66,000 lawyers. So my perspective really comes from my platform this year. As president of the National Bar Association, we tackled 3 pandemics, COVID-19, voter suppression, as well as police brutality, which is front and center here in the United States. When we talk about what happened on January 6th, I put that in the category of the voter suppression pandemic that we're confronting here, because no sooner than the victory in Georgia, where I'm living now, the Georgia Senate runoff elections on January 5th, where historically Reverend Raphael Warnock became the US Senator from Georgia with John Ossoff. Not even 24 hours later, we saw the attempted coup d'etat, and I'm so happy that you characterize it as an attempted coup d'etat, because that's what it was. This notion of a protest, people just, complaining, no, it was an attempted coup d'etat, an attempted takeover of the United States government that was brought upon or incited by the former president. And that is a key distinction. That has not happened in this country since the 1800s. So for people who are downplaying the significance of what happened on January 6th of 2021, they are sorely mistaken at what actually happened. If you want to talk about where the right wing in this country and where white supremacists are in this country and what their intentions are in this country, all you have to do is look back at January 6th of 2021 and you will get your answer. So they are alive and well. Since that time, since the swearing in of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, we have seen in this country over 30 states that have either implemented into law voter suppression laws that were designed to prevent, preclude, or stall or oppress people's right to vote. And might I just say, usually Black and brown people. It's not just any old people, it's Black and brown people, because in their view, in the right wing's view, the Black and brown people are the ones primarily responsible for putting Joe Biden and Kamala Harris into office. And by the way, they're right. It was primarily Black and brown people in this country that made a difference, and young people. And when I say Black and brown people, that means African Americans, people of African descent. That means the Latinx community. That means Asian Americans, and that means young folks. Because after all, when we saw in this country people protesting because of George Floyd's heinous murder, what we saw were people of all shades and colors marching hand in hand, just like Reverend Jackson said, we should, a real rainbow push coalition marching for justice, marching against police brutality, and marching in favor of Black Lives Mattering. So when we think of what's happening in this country, racism in some respects, and racial disparities are at an all-time high, there is a measure of justice that we saw in the verdict of Derek Chauvin. But that measure of justice was an important measure of justice because we saw the perfect aligning of an attorney general, by the way, one of my members, Keith Ellison, a star-studded group of prosecutors, one of my members, Jerry Blackwell as well, and others who tried that case to perfection. A climate in that city, in Minneapolis, and jurors willing to take that bold step, because in the context of police brutality cases, that verdict reflected a bold step, and to call truth to power and to let justice reign. And despite the criticism, despite the protests from the right-wing organizations and those who threatened to kill many who supported a verdict against Derek Chauvin, that jury did what it felt was best and where the evidence led it. But what people need to understand globally is that is not the DNA of how police brutality cases go in the United States. That is how they should go. That is what should be the result when the evidence supports it, but that's not how it happens. So that was a measure of justice. We hope that it continues, but we have to remember here we are fighting on a daily basis voter suppression. Reverend Jackson has been fighting voter suppression since before the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act was designed to give Black and brown people the right to vote, because even though women in this country on the books had the right to vote generations before then, Black women and women of color did not have the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That is critical because that underscores how in this country you can have a law on the books, but it's not reflected in reality, just like the emancipation of the slaves. It took 2 years before, and that's why we celebrate Juneteenth, before there was the actual implementation of freedom in this country. Just as we have a lot of things in this country where on the books of law say one thing and practice something else happens. So from my view, to answer the question, where are we? We have a fight ahead of us. In Portuguese, a luta continua. Vitória é certa, but a luta continua. The struggle continues here for racial harmony, for racial equity, for racial justice, for social justice. And we have to fight every single day because we live amidst pandemics that are not medical pandemics. COVID-19 just underscored the disparity. A disparity, by the way, that we knew before. George Floyd's death underscored a disparity that in our community we've seen forever. We've never seen a time when Black men and Black women weren't killed, weren't murdered at the hands of law enforcement. What happened was mainstream America saw the murder thanks to a 17-year-old soldier, an angel, who videotaped that, because I dare say, had she not videotaped that and had her mother not allowed that to go viral, the outcome could have been different in terms of mainstream America seeing it in living color. But there are thousands of Breonna Taylors, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery's out there, thousands of them. And I'm proud to say that our National Bar Association members have been the advocates of many of them and are on the front lines of that fight on the high profile cases and the low profile cases. You know, you see Ben Crump on those cases and Daryl Parks and Lee Merritt and Lonita Baker and so many other, Chris Stewart, but we've been fighting that fight for a long time.
Well, we thank you for fighting that fight. We thank you for holding up as a collective a vision of true justice that goes beyond what's written in the law, but making sure there's true justice. And we just thank you for all of your leadership. We're going to come back to you because we know there's a lot you have to share. But let us, if we can, and you touched on it as well, right? That this has got to be a rainbow struggle, as Reverend Jackson and Rainbow Push team, you know, so well capture that it's got to be a rainbow of peoples, of communities, of families coming together to fight injustice. And we want to touch on another kind of horrific expression of this white supremacist and racist ideology that's emerging, and in terms of the attacks on particularly the Asian and Asian Pacific communities in the US and around the world. And we wondered if we could maybe shift to the phenomenal Reverend Dr. Grace Ji-sun Kim, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, but she's also, she does so much. Asian Christianity in the Diaspora is a series that she edits. She is a phenomenal leader and thinker, hosting a podcast on Christian Century, and just so much that she does. So if we can turn to you to share your reflections on this moment of incredible pain, but also a moment of some victories. And so where do you see it from your lens, and what is your sort of call to action for those who are joining us today, wanting to carry forward the dreams of our ancestors?
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here and to listen to all the other fabulous panelists. So thank you so much for making this a rainbow panel. I just wanted to say I received my PhD at the University of Toronto, but I teach at Earlham School of Religion, which is in Richmond, Indiana. So to share a little bit about the Asian American, the Asian hate crimes that is happening, you know, I think from the last March 2020 till now, a new organization formed, which is Stop AAPI Hate, and they are taking and recording the number of hate crimes that have been committed against the AAPI community. And I think for the last year, it's been over 4,000 hate crimes committed, and some of those are verbal, physical, and murder. And I think when we look at the statistics, we are alarmed that this many hate crimes could have happened, but we also know that Asian Americans live with the honor shame system, and some of us do not want to report what has happened to us because of the shame that falls on us and our family and the rest of our community. So we know that the hate crimes are higher than what is being reported. We have witnessed some of those hate crimes by videotape and security camera tapes that have been shared on social media and on the news. But we must be aware that even though there is this high number of hate crimes committed, this is not new to our Asian American community. You know, we came in the 1600s, and then the bulk of our immigration started in 1800s. And when we came, we were working as indentured workers. Some went to Hawaii and worked in the sugarcane. Some worked on the railroad here, and many of us died working on the railroad. You know, there were white workers and there were Asian American workers. The white workers were paid a lot more than the Asian American workers. The white workers were given food as they worked. Asian Americans were not given food. So out of the measly amount of pay that they got, they had to pay for food. And also the dangerous work of dynamite, blowing things up, was performed by Asian Americans. So many Asian Americans died. And when we think about the immigration, in 1882, Congress had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is the first act of stopping and banning any racialized group from coming into the United States. So in 1882, because of the racism, discrimination, and xenophobia against Chinese, they had passed that law, and it was supposed to be in place for only 10 years. And it kept getting renewed and renewed and renewed. So during that time, it wasn't just against the Chinese. Anyone that looked like Chinese were also barred and prevented and withheld from owning property and etc. So there was a lot of hate already against Asian Americans during that time. And Asian Americans, with the 14th Amendment, if you were born here, you can become citizen. That was not allowed against the Chinese. So there were all these restrictions placed against the Chinese during that time. They had to carry papers. If they left the country, it was hard for them to come back into the country. So during that time, they had no voting. Chinese couldn't vote. Asian Americans couldn't vote till 1943. So that's a very recent time in our own history, and not every Asian Americans were allowed to vote since 1943. It was a slow inclusion. 1946, I think the Indian Americans were allowed to vote, and slowly the other Asian Americans were allowed to vote. So this is a very recent part of our history, and we have to remember that the hate that has happened against Asian Americans is not a new phenomena. We need to stop the hate. We need to stop the discrimination, the xenophobia, and the marginalization. And I know, with all this crime against people of color, America was built on the labor of people of color as they brought Africans and made them enslaved. And then we think of the genocide of the Native Americans here on this soil, where a bulk of the Native Americans were slaughtered. And, when we think about sports and we have Redskins, there's a large movement to get rid of racial terms such as redskin that comes from the genocide of the Native Americans. They had to, white people who murdered and killed Native Americans, they had to show their bodies to get paid. Then they complained that the bodies were too heavy, so they said, bring heads only. And after the heads were shown, then they said, that's too heavy. So they said, bring just a scalp and you'll be paid. So that's where the Redskins come from. And I think these racialized terms should be eliminated. When we think of the Latinx community, we took a bulk of Mexican land, and what still is happening in the border with the Mexico and the US border, these are hate crimes and hate and racism against people of color. So we need to be aware of all our history and our present time today. So many African Americans were lynched, but one of the biggest lynching that happened was against the Chinese community in LA around 1917, where reports are different. 18 or 19 people were murdered at that time. And that's 10% of the Asian population in that LA area. So we have to remember our past so that we don't repeat what has happened, all these hate crimes against people of color and the discrimination that happens. And so now during the pandemic, I can't ever forget what happened in the Atlanta area, where the young man went to the 3 spas and murdered 8 people on March 16. That will be forever ingrained. And that just shows you the hate crime that is committed against people of color. It took a while for people to say that that was a hate crime, but to us in the AAPI community, of course it was a hate crime. Witnesses have said that he wanted to kill all Asian Americans. He had hatred towards Asian Americans. He had visited those spas and he knew who were working there and who went there. So it was a targeted hate crime. And so when we think about these murders and many of the AAPI hate crimes that are committed from the pandemic are towards women and the elderly. These have been caught on camera. And we think about, people think that they can commit these crimes because they can get away with it, targeting the vulnerable women and targeting the elderly. The elderly have been stomped on, pushed, and yelled at. And during these scuffles, many elderly have died. So it is very painful for me to be part of this community, that it's happening to my own brothers and sisters. It's happening to younger kids too. My two of my kids, well, one of them now is in college. So when I think about the hate crimes that are also happening on campus, it brings tears to my eyes. And we know it's not just happening to the Asian American community, it's happening to all people of color. I must also emphasize, in the 1960s, white sociologists had come up with the term model minority, and they used it against all of us as people of color. So they said, for Asian Americans, if only, they called us the model minority. So they used it against African Americans, the Native Americans, and Latinx, saying, oh, only if you worked as hard, you would be successful as the Asian Americans. But we know that's only a myth. There's so many Asian Americans. If you just visit Flushing, New York, so many living in poverty. And we know that not all Asian Americans are doing well in society. So that term, created by white sociologists, is a form of white supremacy. It was used to pit us Asian Americans against other people of color. And white people continue to use that term. And we Asian Americans continue to fight against that term, because what it does is it breaks us and it makes us be angry with one another. And that's not what we should be doing. We need to be in solidarity with one another. We need each other's help to fight against the racism, the discrimination, the xenophobia that happens here on American soil. So we need to be in solidarity and stand with our African American sisters and brothers, Latinx, and Native Americans, and all people of color. So I'm grateful for the work of Rainbow Push and Reverend Jackson. I know he recently went to celebrate Asian Americans and African American solidarity, and remembering George Floyd and Vincent Chan, the murder of these two innocent people. So I'm grateful that we can continue to work together and be in solidarity and fight white supremacy and any crime committed against people of color, not just here in the US, but around the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for that powerful reminder that this is a global struggle and a rainbow struggle. Thank you so much for giving us the historic analysis as well as the current context. If there is one thing you would want people listening to do, what would that be, Dr. Kim?
Well, I think we need to remember and know our history. We know that, my three kids grew up here in the States. They don't know much about the Asian American history, nor the enslavement of Africans. It's not told very clearly, and it's always told by the white lens, the white people. So we need to remember our history. We need to tell our history. We need to share it, and we need to be in solidarity with one another and fight forward. We Asian Americans can't do this alone. We're only 6% of the American population here. We're 60% of the world population, but we need our brothers and sisters to stand together to fight the hate crime, especially during this pandemic. So many of people that I know have been targeted. It brings tears to my eyes. So I hope that people who are listening can be in solidarity. We need lawyers, we need Congress people, we need everybody to fight against and label things that have happened to people in our community as hate crime. There's nothing else. There's no other name to describe it. So we need to be in solidarity. And I'm just grateful for the other panelists that have enlightened, and we need to work together to change laws and move forward. So thank you so much for all the work that everyone does on this panel and everyone that at Rainbow Push too. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of those remarks and reminders and calls to action. Please let us hear Again, from you, Attorney Huffler, you hear Dr. Kim talking about the needs to kind of to have lawyers, the important role that lawyers have played. But we also recognize the law doesn't always go far enough. And we also recognize, as you have said, that there are changes underway to restrict voting rights. Democracy is very much under threat, not only in those over 30 states, but really throughout the country. So I guess just in terms of your analysis of actions that are needed, and I know there are both in the Senate and the House in the U.S. And legislation that's in place that is still needing support. Could you share with us your thoughts on, again, SR1, HR1? It's the first legislation of the session for Congress that's focused on protecting democracy. Could you share your lens on those, and also perhaps the movement now in Congress and across the country on reparations?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me just say that we stand, as Dr. Grace knows, we stand in solidarity with our Asian and Asian Pacific brothers and sisters. That was one of the things that as soon as the incident happened in March, we stood in solidarity with our bar associations because we all meet and issued a statement. But it's more than just issuing a statement. We were committed to helping because there's an uptick of violence against Asian American, Asian Pacifics, and the Americans in this country. And so just as we share, it's an awful thing to have in common, right? Who wants to stand in solidarity because we both share such violence against our communities, but we do stand in solidarity, and we are committed, remain committed, the National Bar, and of course at Rainbow Push, to helping and with action items there. But in terms of what is happening and what needs to happen, I believe there needs to be a tripartite approach. We need to have the passage of the comprehensive bill that addresses civil rights and voting rights by the US Senate. Because in our way of government, the House will introduce the legislation that goes to the Senate. And as you know, we have the administration of the Democrats have a very, very delicate position in the Senate, even though they now stand finally in unity in order to pass a bill such as Senate 1, which was part of HR1, morphed into that. We need, with rules relative to filibuster, 10 more votes. And of course, the Republican Party is standing in unison and is not going to support that measure. So there needs to be dramatic measures taken, and perhaps to do away with this notion of the filibuster. That's a political discussion that needs to take place. Because if we do not have a global voting rights act, no matter what you call it, we are going to be subjected to the whims of different states that will enact and impose suppressive and oppressive voting rights bills, as we've seen in Georgia, as we've seen in Texas and throughout the country. And by the way, when I say suppressive, that means that literally your vote can be challenged by someone who's a middle person can look at your signature and say, well, this just doesn't look right. I think we're going to challenge this ballot. And while they're challenging it, they know, of course, that you might be a Democrat, that you might be Black or brown or Asian, Native American, and they know what your position is when they are challenging it. It's very targeted, and it's classic voter suppression. So we've got to do something to eliminate that, because with the unraveling of the Voting Rights Act due to the opinion in the Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013, we have to have a federal standard so that across the board, no matter where you are, there are rules that are anti-discrimination in voting rules that are in place. So that's critically important. But we have to have a tripartite approach. So on a legislative, federal, state, and local level, we must fight voter suppression. The bill in the Senate, that's a federal. On a state level, where you have the bureaus of election, or every state is different, the committees that are running the elections, they too have an uneven application of the law. So we have to have our groups in the field, voting advocacy groups, election protection groups, which are nonpartisan, to ensure that there is not a disproportionate amount of pressure or voter suppression in Black and brown communities or communities that are more progressive. So that's on the federal level, state and local level, legislative level. But we also have to have our grassroots organizations, Rainbow Push Coalition, Transformative Justice Coalition, all the voting, Black Voters Matter Fund, all of those groups have to also work in sync to inform our voters, to inform our people in the community of what to do. There was so much disinformation throughout the country during the presidential elections, and even more so during the Georgia runoff elections. Where people thought they were supposed to vote a different day. They thought they didn't have to vote. They didn't think they could vote. Basic things that you would think people would know about, they didn't know because of the disinformation on social media. So it's up to the grassroots organization to fill in that gap, and community leaders. And then finally, the lawyers, the legal community has to work hand in hand with the legislative and the grassroots, because the lawyers are the only ones that can speak truth to power in the courts. They can bring the lawsuits. That's why, for instance, in Georgia, organizations are represented in litigation against the voter suppressive laws. Before the runoff election for the Senate race in Georgia, there was litigation that I was involved in, and other members of the National Bar, against those who were in charge of the elections, because we felt that up to 200,000 Georgians were illegally purged from the rolls. So we have to do all of that. The lawyers have to step up to the plate, and it can be done in a nonpartisan way, which is the way it should be, or in a partisan way, because we all should want people to have the right to vote. So in my impression, all of those things have to be done. And those are the action items.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So, again, this is a global conversation of all that's needed to kind of lift our communities to where we need to be. So I wondered if we could go back across the Atlantic, back to the UK. And Lord Simon, if you could share with us any further thoughts. You've heard now reflections from France, from the US. Any further thoughts as we wind down this conversation, particularly focused on things that we would encourage those who are listening to do?
When you consider what we've got right now, we've got people in different parts of the world coming together to have a wonderful, empowering, enlightening conversation. This is where our strength lies. The challenge, we know the challenge, right? It's structural white supremacy that moves in pivots to wrestle power within, lock people out. And what we need to do is that our disparate parts need to be connected by a golden thread, if you like, something like the Rainbow Push Coalition and broader, and bring us into the same sphere where we're not just sharing stories with one another, but we're collaborating too. When you think about this panel and the connections that we all have, that imagine where if we share them, if we utilize them for each other's struggle. When I speak to Grace and I connect her, or with the Asian communities here in the UK, and so when she comes here, they know about her, and vice versa. This is where it lies. We don't have great resources, but we have great ideas and creativity. And I think that we've got to be smarter than we've ever been before, because our detractors, Amira, are constantly moving to lock us out. I say to many people in these types of Zooms in this past year, that last year was the year of talk, this year must be the year of action. And I know that a lot of white people, allies, are nodding with us. We've got to translate that to action too, in business and in politics. But I'm with Diane on this one, in as much as the USA is perceived by many as perhaps the most powerful nation on the planet. You now have two good leaders. We don't expect you in the States to take the foot off the gas now, because you can show real leadership and you can say to our European partners, we're not asking you to get on board, we're demanding it. It's all up for grabs but let's lean into it and seize the opportunity that we have, Chair.
Lean into it and seize the opportunities. Yes, I think that's probably a wonderful segue. Diane Abbott, anything further as we lean in and seize the opportunity that you would flag?
Well, of course, Simon is right. We have to lean in, we have to seize the opportunities, and we have to network internationally, which is what makes this event so important, and learning from each other and connecting with each other, because racism is a global force on the continent of Europe, in Britain, in North America, and it requires us to act globally. But it's been a real pleasure to take part in this event, and I've learned an awful lot. So thank you very much, Amira.
I just want to bring this up for our panelists. From generation to generation, we have seen that government policy, public policy, has been designed to reduce the potential for racism and its manifestations. I think we are looking at this from those who are affected. The question is, how do we convince those who are perpetuating racism that what they're doing is socially unacceptable? Because from year to year, you see a proliferation of folks, organizations that are continuously forming the fuel of racism. How do we convince these people that what they are doing is unacceptable? And when would this thing end, the structure of racism? That's my question.
Tough question. Dr. Grace, let's start with you. Any response to that?
That is a tough question. If I had the answer, I think maybe that would be great. But as a theologian and as an ordained minister, my thing is always rethinking Christianity, because Christianity influences how we treat and how we view one another. So what we saw on January 6th, that violent attack, so many people said, oh, those are Christians and evangelical Christians. But I'm thinking, how can they be Christians? I think we have to rethink Christianity. I think we have to differentiate ourselves from Christian nationalism, which puts whiteness ahead. America flag over the Christian cross. And I think for me, it's also rethinking who God is. For so long, Christianity emerged in the Greco-Roman era. And so much Greek philosophy has been influencing Christianity. And Christianity always said that God was white. When we think about, or God is male, that was another problem too. But I think we need to reimagine God. God is spirit. That means God is not black or white. And so we have to emphasize that God created all of us in God's image, whether we're living in Africa, Europe, Asia, South America, we are all created in God's image. And if we can just get that across in our heads, then we will realize that we're all brothers and sisters. And Native Americans will say that, creatures that God created are our cousins. If we can see that too, then I think we can also fight against climate injustice that's happening in the climate change. So I think once we can reimagine God in different lens, beyond the whiteness of God, James Cone, one of the important Black theologians here in the US, talked about Black God and Black Jesus. If we can reimagine, rethink, and change our language, particularly within Christianity, because even though you're not Christian here in the US, at least, there is so much Christian influence here because of Christian nationalism. I think a lot of that has to happen. A lot of that has to be unpacked, and we have to name it and get rid of white supremacy, even in our own religion, which is doing so much damage. There's so much racism in the church, in Christian schools and Christian communities and bodies. Yes. So we really need to fight against that. Thank you.
Thank you for that very powerful recommendation. Any other thoughts? I see, please, Diane Abbott, we go to you and then to Attorney Huffler.
Well, just to say, responding to Ewa's point about how do we convince people that racism is unacceptable, there will be people that you will never convince that racism is unacceptable because they benefit from it, or at least they're told by politicians that they benefit from it. I do think, though, that younger people of all colours are perhaps more open-minded and open to understanding how racism is detrimental, not just to people of colour, but to everyone. I think with younger people, but I think in the end, what we have to do as people who are committed to racial justice is to show racist political leaders that they can't succeed and that we are going to come together and oppose them, whether it's voting out Donald Trump, whether it's hopefully in a year or so voting out Boris Johnson. In the end, because there are people who believe they benefit from racism, you're never going to convince everybody that is not acceptable.
Thank you for that reality check. Attorney Huffler, you wanted to
agree 100%. I want to say that, Diane, you stole the words right out of my mouth. Without a question, you cannot change the minds of people who were storming the US Capitol on January 6th and convince them that racism is not real or that they're racist or that it's a bad thing. Quite to the contrary, they are more entrenched in their position since January 6th because it was a failed coup d'etat. It wasn't a successful coup, it was a failed coup. So they want to get to the bottom line, which is to reinstall Donald Trump into the presidency. They are now more persuaded more than ever. But young folks, the young people in this country and throughout the world, see, those are the people who we have a chance, I believe, of influencing and whose minds are more open. It is, in fact, in this country, the young people who were protesting. It is, in fact, the young people who were out there voting in the trenches, Black, white, Latinx, Asian American, Native American, a global, a rainbow coalition. They are the ones that made a difference, and they are our future. That's where I have hope, even just in our organization. So that's why I think we need to focus our attention.
Brilliant. Lord Simon, please go right ahead.
Sure. Well, you know, it's always a balancing act and a judgment, because as Diane said, there are some hard, die-in-the-war racist who live and breathe, froth that hatred. Forget them. They're always going to be that way. And then there's a young group that Ms. Hoffler spoke about, who marched, who want the change because they know that it benefits them. And then there's some in the middle. And I think those in the middle, rather than bludgeon them in a way that says you're a racist, and we have to take them on a journey. It's hard work and it's tiring, but we've got to take them on a journey that says, actually, the hatred that you are fed does you no good. Never mind me, it does you no good because it poisons your soul. All this talent on your doorstep, you're locking out because of that poisoned rhetoric that you are digesting. And imagine for a second, all this talent working together for the greater good. Take them on a journey, almost hand holding them. And then they can see, actually, this is the critical thing, the benefits for them too. And I think that when you're taking them on this wonderful pathway to enlightenment, that you can see it's good for us, it's good for them, it's good for everyone. But Diane will tell you, it's tiring.
Not at all an easy course. I think you've all made that quite clear. But I think we also have to hold up, our sister Rakia is not here, but the filmmakers, the creative artists who are using their various media to to tackle this question, bring it squarely to the table and say we must end the hate and fight for racial justice, and using all of their creative genius to bring that to the fore. Now, what we haven't touched on is the UN. There's so many levers of this kind of global struggle. wonder how you all see the UN as we now come to the 20th anniversary of the Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia, Durban 20. How do you see, things like the UN Human Rights Commission's report on racism as are these vehicles that can help carry our struggle forward? Can engage in the dialogue with those who need to be brought on this journey, as Lord Simon said. But are you all using that mechanism, and to what extent do you see that as part of the
Well, Chair, could I say, wasn't there a proposal just a few weeks ago in which Black groups put a proposal to the United Nations that we look at the Afrophobia and systemic racism? And to my horror, it was voted down by the USA, by the UK, and several other nations. The vast majority of the Black and brown nations of the world in Africa and Asia voted for it. But because the powerful few in the UN voted against it, including Biden's USA, I was horrified. I was horrified to see it. As a matter of fact, so these institutions are still rigged against our nations. And I don't know how we breach them, Diane, Ms. Hoffler. I don't know how, but I know they're not always working for us.
You want to look at the United Nations as a toothless bulldog when it comes to human rights, because if they continue to perpetuate this kind of injustice by voting against things that every other person likes, why do we continue to utilize the United Nations as a problem-solving entity when it is against us, Black folks?
Well, I would say, look, I mean, it's embarrassing, right?
Yeah.
It's an embarrassment when, like for me, as a citizen of the United States, I grew up in Geneva, Switzerland. I studied in Toronto, Canada, and went to school in the US just for college. That's where I started, even though I'm American. And it is an embarrassment that on something that is so crystal clear, I hate to even say even Stevie Wonder, Ray Charles, everybody could see that we would vote against it. I'm sure there was some provision, something that they found to be objectionable, but the overall sentiment is just something that I live, breathe, and we live and breathe in this country. It wouldn't be the first time that the US has voted against something that the global community supported wholeheartedly. So we have to keep on working within. I believe that the United Nations is a powerful tool. I do believe that the UN commissions that have endorsed, that gave a report on police brutality in the United States applied pressure as a source of embarrassment, where we here in this country are supposed to be, some would say, the golden standard for law enforcement, for this, for equity, for elections and all of that. And yet we are falling so short based on what people are seeing and the evidence and litigation out there. I think that pressure did have an impact ultimately, and is having an impact on what's happening here in the US, just as outside pressure, we believe, here in the US had an impact on the fall of the apartheid regime and the freeing of Nelson Mandela. I mean, Reverend Jackson and those soldiers here who protested and who put pressure on US companies doing business in South Africa played a significant role in the apartheid, that awful apartheid regime falling down and being overcome, as well as, we believe, Nelson Mandela being freed from jail. So I think there is a role for the international community, and I think it has had an impact even with police brutality here in the US. But it is devastating and embarrassing when on something so simple, the US votes against it.
Well, I agree with what you've just heard. It's deeply embarrassing when a country like Britain and a country like America, which would claim to believe in human rights and claim to believe in truth and justice, vote down things which so many other countries support. But I don't agree that the UN is completely a toothless bulldog. We've mentioned apartheid, And obviously, in the end, the struggle against apartheid was fought and won by the Black peoples of South Africa, led by Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo and so forth. But I think that the United Nations and things that were done and motions that were passed in the United Nations played a role. And I think we are at a moment, we have to withstand and overcome global racism or white nationalism in any way that we can. And we have to use any weapon that comes to hand. And the UN might be a weapon in particular contexts.
I think Diane's right, Chair, very, very much so. But my frustration is, just a couple of weeks ago, we had the world's G7 on our islands in a place called Cornwall. And when I looked at these men and women, all white, all refusing to give the poorest countries in the world debt relief, some of those countries spending 30, 40, 50% of their GDP on debt relief, but rather than medicine and education. And those leaders, our leaders, sat there around the table and in effect would let people die. And this is it's an uncomfortable truth, but it's a rigged global system that we as activists in those countries need to be brave to acknowledge, ask the searing questions, and demand change.
I just wanted to add to that. I think when you see the leaders that are white, we need to fight the white privilege and the whiteness. There's an African-American theologian, Shaniqua Walker Barnes, who writes, whiteness was created as a way of determining who got to partake of the benefits of white supremacy. So we know white people will continue to use their own privilege and to just make themselves more comfortable, reap all the benefits, and walk on the backs of people of color. So I think we need to name it and understand how whiteness works and how white privilege works, and how white Christian nationalism also works here in the US and in other parts of the world. It's very dangerous, and I think we need to name it. I think for a long time, being white was kind of elusive, but I think we need to be able to name what is wrong and move forward. And no organization will be 100% great. So UN will have its flaw, as well as other organizations and even our churches here in the US.
My other question is to see exactly how we can educate poor nations about what is going on in the world in terms of structural racism. How do we continue to educate them towards a realization that, look, yes, people are coming here and giving you aid. They are coming here to take advantage of you, and you need to do or know something about why they are coming here, because if we continue to accept this nonsense, as far as I'm concerned, without giving them a full education of the implications of what these folks do to each country as a poor nation, then we are defeating the purpose of being a partner in their own world upbringing.
Well, my dear friends, I feel like there could be a panel just on that, right? On that alone, right? Because I think clearly white supremacy has been with us for centuries, and we've got to acknowledge that. And I think you all said it brilliantly. The rules are rigged. They're rigged in favor of those with wealth, and they're generally white and generally male, to hold on to that wealth at all costs. Huh? So we have quite frankly, the richest nations on the planet that are impoverished because of those white supremacists and the corporations they represent, the militaries that hold them in place, because they want to have their way, to continue to exploit. And I think what we have to acknowledge, as you all have said, we've come a long ways. Our ancestors did fight to end the scourge of apartheid. Our ancestors did fight to end the scourge of Jim Crow. Our ancestors did fight to end the slave trade and the horrors of slavery. So we come to activism today on that history, standing rooted in the courage and the boldness that they lived, and carrying that forward for future generations to continue this fight, continue this struggle. So, yes, there are no perfect institutions, but each of you have chosen a path to shape the institutions where you can, whether it's the church or the parliament or the courts or the people's minds through film, right? Each of you have chosen a path to challenge the status quo, to demand justice for our people, and to raise your voice to make sure that the world lives up to really, the necessity to honor the dignity of all human. So we thank you for all that you do. We thank Rainbow Push for understanding the power of the rainbow, bringing together a coalition of leaders around the world that are rooted in their own struggle, but understanding that this is a global struggle for justice and dignity. And so we just, we thank you for your time. We thank those who have joined us virtually across this media. We ask you to continue to stay engaged. We encourage you to reach out to the leaders that are part of this panel today through Twitter, through all the social media platforms. But we also encourage you to be a firm member of the movements for change, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Rainbow Push. These movements are at the vanguard of the change that the world needs. So join them, join us, continue as Attorney Hoffler said, a luta continua, right? We will continue the struggle, and we will go so much further because of each of you. Thank you for your leadership, thank you for your boldness, and thank you for your time today.